Tyler tilted to one side as a most unusual sensation overpowered him. He had to put out a hand against a tree trunk to steady himself. Despite that, he felt almost giddy. It reminded him of the one time he'd tried fire whiskey in mortal form. It was not an experience he'd wanted to repeat. Stumbling, he went to the ground. The whole world seemed to spin above him, and he closed his eyes to try and block out the sensation. He lay there for what felt like an eternity until the sensation passed. When he opened his eyes, Tyler realized the night had almost ended. Sunlight began to color the sky a brilliant red. He still felt a bit lightheaded when he stood. As his head cleared, his thoughts returned to Anwen. Had something happened to her to cause his own symptoms just now? He doubted the sensation had occurred because of anything he'd done or not done. Fearing he knew not what, Tyler retraced his steps until he picked up her trail once more. He paused for a moment when the tracks doubled back on themselves, but he was able to pick up the fresher trail a few paces further on. It did not take long to find the incline where Anwen had rolled down in an almost drunken haze. Seeing her at the bottom, he slid down the slope, sending up a shower of dirt behind him.
Anwen,
he called out, his breath catching in his throat as he realized she wasn't moving. Upon reaching her side, Tyler noticed her eyes were closed, but she was breathing. Her pulse felt slow but steady against his own. It was almost as though she were asleep. He touched her shoulder, calling her by name. Anwen's eyes opened, but there was something off about them. It took Tyler a moment to realize what it was. Her irises were liquid amber in color, and even though her eyes were open, they didn't seem to focus on what was around her. The faint scent of something he didn't quite recognize wafted from her skin. Bending closer, he inhaled deeply, taking in the fragrance. After a few moments of contemplation, he was able to identify it. Salvia divinum, diviner's sage. But how she'd come across the plant was beyond him. Anwen slowly sat up. Her eyes still shone gold in color as she turned towards Tyler.
I can see you,
she said, one hand reaching out to almost touch him. She pulled back just before making contact. Her fingers traced outlines of color normal eyes could not see.
That's a good thing,
Tyler responded. Something in her tone was different, he decided. Something had obviously changed. He just wasn't quite sure yet what it was.
How do you feel?
He'd seen the after effects of many who had partaken of the unusual plant, but none had had symptoms quite like this. No one's eyes had ever changed color, and their aura had not changed either. Anwen hadn't so much as blinked as she stared at the dragon, eyes wider than usual.
No, I can see you,
she said.
I see you as a dragon. It doesn't matter. But I can also see every part that composes your body down to the smallest particle. I can see you.
Tyler's eyes widened at this declaration. It's what they'd hoped for, sort of, but not like this. Not with the help of the mage's sage. Perhaps as a last resort, but not before all other means had been tried. The dangers were too great. Margo's method had focused more on hearing the eternal melodies of each particle. Her gift worked best when in harmony with nature. Apparently Anwen's worked by sight of the elemental. It was only a little like how dragon abilities worked. He reached out to touch her with an almost hesitant hand. Heat radiated from her skin long before his fingers touched hers.
Anwen!
He started, almost as if in command, but had stopped short. Anwen moved to stand, arms down at her sides as she stared ahead, ignoring his reaching hand.
I can see the trees,
she continued,
and the particles that make them. They're the same as the one that makes you and me. Like small planets circling miniature suns. I can see the smallest details.
Her eyes widened in awe.
It's beautiful.
Tyler stepped forward to stand beside her. Sometimes the plant had allowed such visions, but the cost was usually high. More than a handful with similar sight had gone blind from the experience. That was why it was better for mortals to hear everything rather than see it. He only hoped there would be no such resulting repercussions in this instance. Concentrating, Tyler tried to reach out to the part of his soul that resided within hers. His soul gaze was met with an aura of brilliant golden light, entwined with hints of red and blue. Silver flashed throughout like a protective cage made of lightning. It seemed to dare anyone to try and displace it. Anwen turned towards Tyler. The morning sunlight glinted off her auburn hair like little sparks of fire. She closed her eyes and leaned into him, her lips meeting his. Both their hearts thumped like drums in perfect harmony. Despite that, Tyler stood frozen in shock. The kiss was brief, but oh so sweet as she pulled away.
You taste like summer.
She observed with a wistful sigh. Tyler felt rooted to the ground, his eyes wide at her rather unexpected advance. He managed, looking at her.
Thank you?
Her eyes had returned to their normal coloring, he noticed. That was a good sign. Perhaps she wouldn't go blind after all. She laughed a giddy, childlike laugh and then spun around.
I feel like I could rewrite the entire fabric of the stars.
She declared as her arms flared out from her sides.
I could just float up to them and bring them down here.
Tyler grabbed her, stopping the mad twirling.
Hold there for a bit.
He advised.
This is the plant talking, not you. Come back down to earth, Anwen.
Anwen collapsed into his arms, still giggling.
How can I when I feel so high?
She reached one hand upwards as if to grab the sky. Staggering a bit under the unexpected weight, Tyler maneuvered so he wouldn't drop her.
High is right. There's a reason using that plan is discouraged. How much did you take?
Smiling a bit crazily, Anwen held up her hand, pointing to her closed palm.
About this much? She said to eat it because it was like medicine.
Another giggle escaped her lips.
Come on, little one.
Tyler said in an almost fatherly tone.
You need to sleep this off.
Swooping her up into his arms, he headed back towards camp. Judging by the size she'd indicated, Anwen had consumed at least a dozen leaves. But who was this she Anwen was talking about? He had no idea, and that bothered him. Certainly Margo would not condone the plant's use, especially not this early in the scheme of things. But if not Margo, who?
Wow.
Anwen said as her relationship with the earth changed.
I can feel your heart beating. It's got a nice rhythm. Reminds me of drums.
She snuggled up against his chest, arms around his neck. Her feet dangled from his strong arms. Tyler rolled his eyes but continued walking. There was only one thing to do. Let the plant's unique qualities run their course and hope for the best. He wasn't sure how long that would take, though. Usually only a leaf or two was chewed. Then, once the sap had been ingested, the quid had been spit out. He never heard of anyone who had just wantonly chewed up and then swallowed so many leaves before. Anwen let her head loll against his shoulder.
I feel like I'm rocking in a giant hammock.
She declared.
It's nice. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like a little baby when you're fasting.
He briefly wondered if this was how she'd ever behave if she were ever to become drunk, then dismissed the notion. Tyler wasn't sure he wanted to find out.
What am I gonna tell your mother?
He looked down to see her reaction, but realized she dozed off instead. He let out a small sigh.
Anwen, you're going to be the death of me.
Walter sat several feet away from the campfire. He had one of the many boxes from his storage locker pulled close. He wiped his brow as he paused in his work. Then he carefully poured a mixture into a small glass container. The glass resembled a holiday ornament. He'd combined various powders with some thick liquid to create a rather explosive concoction. Several other such balls lay in a small pile next to him, already filled and capped. Margo sat across the fire pit, warming her hands in the early chill.
Do I even want to know what those are for?
She asked as she watched him cap yet another orb. He'd been working for at least an hour or so on the mixture, and all that time he'd carefully measured out various ingredients. Smiling, Walter set the sphere down.
Well, let's just say they'll make a lot of noise and cause a lot of confusion when they shatter.
He answered.
And, in larger quantities, cause a lot more chaos.
He thought about bringing the plastic explosives, but had decided against it. He'd heard and read too many tales about the mages to risk having an electric timer they could mess with.
Sounds entertaining.
Margo finally replied. She turned at the sound of Courtney crawling out of their tent.
Good morning, sleepyhead. It's about time you woke up. I was almost ready to come in after you.
The girl emerged into the light through the low doorway. Courtney yawned as she stood and walked over to the crackling fire.
I feel stiff all over.
She complained as she took a seat next to Anwen's mother.
Is the coffee ready?
She reached for the metal pot sitting next to the flames. She remembered to grab an insulating cloth just before touching the hot metal.
Smells good.
She reached for a mug and poured a cup. The sound of twigs breaking caused Courtney to pause just as she was about to take a sip. All eyes turned towards the direction of the sound. She fumbled for her bone knife while Margo reached for a kitchen utensil. Walter hefted one of his exploding balls, ready to throw it. Tyler pushed through the trees and strode into camp, causing them all to relax. Margo noted he was carrying Anwen in his arms. It took her a moment to realize he was coming from a different direction than where the girl was supposed to be. She couldn't help but wonder at that. The older woman stood, putting her utensils and plate down before striding over.
Morning.
She greeted, looking pointedly at his full arms. The dragon paused as Margo came up and greeted him.
Looks like you've had a busy night.
He resettled Anwen against his chest as she'd managed to slide a bit during the trek back to the others.
Morning.
He returned.
I figured it was time for the lost lamb to return to camp.
He explained at the questioning looks sent his way.
If you don't mind, I'm gonna put her in the tent so she can sleep in peace.
Margo moved to let him pass, watching as he moved to the larger of the two tents. He had to duck to go inside, but somehow managed to not drop the sleeping figure in his arms. Less than a minute later, he was exiting the canvas confines and heading towards the fire. Groaning, he picked out a mug from their collection. He then went to pour himself a cup of the dark beverage simmering on the coals.
That's more like it.
He said with a contented sigh. Courtney picked up her own cup, having put the knife back in her pocket.
I thought Anwen was undergoing special training?
She commented. She glanced towards Margo over the lip of her mug. Part of her wondered how the woman was going to take this development.
She was.
Tyler replied before taking a sip of the rich brew.
I'm taking matters into my own hands now.
Margo looked like she might protest, but settled back on her seat.
I thought we were in agreement with my methods.
She admonished. Part of her wondered where the dragon had been during the previous day, but didn't dare ask. It was sometimes hard to remember that this young-looking man was more than he seemed. Shrugging, Tyler put his mug down.
Certain events made it necessary for me to intercede on your methods.
He replied.
Somehow, Anwen discovered a spurt of salvia divinum. Whether it was out of hunger or something else, I'm not sure. Anything's possible. But she pretty much ate a whole handful of the leaves. At least she didn't eat the flowers along with them. We can thank the stars for that.
Anwen's mother bit her lip as she contemplated what Tyler had just told her.
Salvia divinum. Are you sure?
Her fingers tensed as she gripped the edge of her seat. She'd never seen the plant herself, but had heard of its unique properties and the adverse side effects. Tyler nodded.
Quite sure. And to some interesting results, I might add. I found her after she'd gone through the initial effects. I don't know how it affected her in total, but I have some guesses. What I do know is that it brought on some interesting results.
He then began to tell them what had transpired after he'd found her lying at the bottom of the small hill.
I don't know what visions she may have had, but it'd be interesting to find out.
Courtney watched Margo as she seemed to pull within herself. She glanced over to Walter, who had gone back to filling his glass orbs. Dragon and mage magic didn't have much to do with him. She didn't blame him for at least pretending to not pay attention. He was good at it, if he truly was pretending the disinterest he showed.
So, until she wakes up,
Tyler continued.
There's no way of knowing what effect it might have on her, permanent or otherwise. I'm hoping for the best, but we do need to be prepared for other possibilities.
He was fairly certain Margo knew what he meant. Anwen might still go blind from the sudden opening of her soul sight, and while it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, it hadn't quite been the older mage's aim. But if Anwen retained her sight, both body and soul, it was a far better prospect than he dared hope for. Margo stood from her spot, looking pointedly at Courtney.
If you're finished, we have more training to do.
Courtney groaned.